Alright guys, so next video that I'm going to be taking a look at is requested by Super Saiyan Declonies. I have no idea. Sorry dude, you can put it down in the comments 30,000 times, I'm still going to get it wrong because I suck, and everybody knows this. This is done by Overly Sarcastic Productions, and it is Trope Talk Grimdark. He says that this video directly addresses Warhammer 40k, so we're going to take a look and see if we agree. If you hear something in the background, it is literally because, well, it's starting to freeze outside. And my heater is going full blast. So that's what that is if you're hearing like a humming in the background. But here we go.
It was sponsored by World Anvil, a bright spark of hope in an otherwise cold and uncaring world. The Dark Age of comics officially began in 1986, the year that saw both Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns and Alan Moore's Watchmen. Superhero comics had touched on dark themes before. Chris Claremont's God Loves, Man Kills, an X-Men comic that handled themes of religious zealotry and full-on genocide, came out in 1982, and Alan Moore's take on Swamp Thing, which is deeply grotesque and unsettling, also came out in the early 80s. But this is when comics started getting dark overall. The grittiness became the rule rather than the exception. There was a bit of an arms race, honestly. By the 90s, it almost felt like comic writers were trying to one-up each other in how dark, gory, and morally ambiguous they could make their heroes. This is the complete agreements on this. This is about the same time the death of Superman, Batman getting his back broke, all this kind of stuff happened, and that was light. I remember like Lobo comic covers where people be completely decapitated. It was gory. The era that saw such developments as the characters of Cable, Lobo, Spawn, and John Constantine, and DC's Crisis on Infinite Earths, an attempt at rebooting the entire space of DC Comics that killed off hundreds of characters, most notably Supergirl and The Flash, and some say is still f***ing up canon to this very day. As the 90s rolled on, the comic book Dark Age kept on trucking. The stories got darker, the characters got meaner, and there was this oddly pervasive feeling of embarrassment with the previous eras of comic books. All those colorful spandex superhumans with wildly unrealistic power sets saving the day for truth and justice? How childish. How implausible. Now we had dark spandex superhumans killing people with their wildly unrealistic power sets for personal reasons. See, that's much more believable. Who needs to grow up now, Mom? This was the broad beginning of Grimdark, a space of stories that, true to the name, are grim and dark and nothing else. Grimdark is hard to solidly define, but before we try, we need to dive into the other major contributing factor to the genre, Warhammer 40k, a tabletop minis game first published in 1987. This game is the source of the term Grimdark. The game's tagline is, "In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war." And it's pretty much exactly what it says on the tin. It's the far future, everything sucks, and everybody's fighting all the time. There are no heroes, there's no happy ending, there is only war. So here's the quick rundown. In Warhammer 40k, you pick an army, you spend way too much money buying and painting the minis, and then you use them for tabletop war games with other people and their armies of minis. Most people play as the Imperium of Man, specifically the Space Marines, but if you'd expect them to be the good guys, you are sorely mistaken. In the lore of the game, the Imperium of Man is an authoritarian nightmare that worships the mummified husk of a god emperor who they keep running with daily blood sacrifices. It's got
That's literally the most succinct and to the point synopsis of what 40k is that I have probably ever heard. And I probably couldn't do much better myself.
The propagandistic no free thought allowed vibe of 1984 with exactly none of the subtlety. And the other options aren't any better. There are really bad guys like the Forces of Chaos, demons from a parallel universe known as the Warp, where the psychic emanations of sentient beings from our universe produce twisted monomaniacal demons that rip through the fragile skin of reality to ravage our world. Fun stuff. They're in good company with the Tyranids, a massive psychic hive mind from another galaxy that is systematically using their massive xenomorph-style biomass of murder critters to chew through entire planets and appear to have the galaxy completely surrounded. I mean, between those two forces, everyone's pretty much boned already. The Tyranids.
So this picture that she has up there right now, I have always, I've seen this picture, but at the same time I always kind of disagree with it because the Tyranids cast a shadow in the Warp. And I might be talking out my ass here, but I can't remember a single time where the Chaos Demons actually engaged the Tyranids. Moving on.
Are chewing through space, and the Forces of Chaos are punching big holes in it every time a psychic gets a headache. But it doesn't stop there. You can play as the Necrons, the last remnant of an ancient empire that tried to escape death and instead turned into Terminator space zombies. Or the Orcs, green-skinned space football hooligans who have literally no priorities besides war. Or you could do what I did and play the Eldar, gorgeous, elegant, psychic space elves
whose massive space empire was pretty awesome until they partied so hard it created a chaos god that shattered their empire and turned half of them into bondagey murder space pirates, leaving the rest wasting away on massive spaceships, recycling their souls into giant robots because there aren't enough of them to fight otherwise. Or maybe you want to play as the Tau, fresh-faced alien newcomers who are looking to build a pan-galactic space empire by subjugating all other races using mind control.
This is true.
It's always something. There really is no winning. Warhammer 40k is kind of the platonic ideal of Grimdark. There are literally no good options, and thanks to the infinite forces of chaos, there's really no winning. There's no heroes, no unified bad guy to target, no Death Star to destroy. There's just war, and plenty of it. And most likely thanks to the 1-2 punch of the comic book Dark Age and Warhammer 40k exploding onto the scene, their shared aesthetic of Grimdark got mad popular starting in the 90s. This is also, not coincidentally, around when White Wolf started publishing their notoriously grim World of Darkness games. Now, since Grimdark is more of a vibe than a genre,
when I was a kid, I remember that, preachers would give up and give sermons on Vampire the Masquerade and Werewolf. And it was not very comfortable.
It's a little tricky to strictly define, but there's a few key factors that help narrow it down. See, lots of stories are gritty and dark without going full grimdark, which is a totally different ballgame, but it can be very easy to get them confused. For one thing, Grimdark has no heroes. It can certainly have protagonists, but those protagonists aren't heroes. Their motivations are usually entirely self-centered and morally dubious, their methods are deeply unpleasant, they're typically quite self-destructive, and overall they're not what you'd think of as a good person. They can be very sympathetic and relatable, but they're not someone you'd look up to exactly. Heroes often represent ideals. Grimdark protagonists don't. There are plenty of gritty, dark protagonists who are full-on heroes with paragon ideals or a strong sense of justice, and those guys aren't Grimdark. And when they get rewritten as Grimdark, it feels weird. If you take a Grimdark setting and put a hero in it, they don't fit. Either the world bends around them through the sheer force of their protagonistness and ungrimdarks the setting, or the Grimdark wins and they die, usually very nastily.
For reference, see Conrad Curse in that aspect.
Grimdark and heroes can't coexist. This is a case where Warhammer 40k has kind of an advantage. For the most part, as a war game, individual characters don't matter. There are a few special units with names and backstories, and the lore has plenty of characters in it, but no matter how cool their alleged narrative accomplishments might be, when the game gets going, they usually die pretty quick anyway. However, there are some tie-in novels that put focus more on individual protagonists, and those novels tend to have a much less overwhelmingly gritty tone than the actual game lore does. The world is still a hot mess, but the characters do heroic things, and care about each other on a very deep level, and forge genuine lasting friendships and other such hopeful things that don't normally feature in Grimdark narratives. While the game is Grimdark, it's hard to write a compelling story in that setting, so the books end up being not quite Grimdark. Now, another key factor is that Grimdark has no real hope for a happy ending. Some stories come with clean solutions: blow up the Death Star, destroy the artifact, defeat the evil emperor, put the one true king on the throne, return with the elixir, a simple goal that our heroes have to accomplish to win. Grimdark doesn't have that simple fix. If the world is unpleasant and broken, our protagonists have no simple way of improving it. Maybe the government is corrupt all the way up, or the deities themselves are evil, or the world is just boned in 1,000 different ways and fixing one won't do anything for the other 999. Saving the world...
The last one is 40k.
Isn't on the table. In absence of a clean solution, Grimdark narratives can still have smaller scale victories on the table. Maybe our protagonists will never overthrow their authoritarian regime, but they can successfully dissuade small scale agents of that regime from messing with their little corner of the planet. Or your cosmic horror setting doesn't really give you the option of defeating the elder gods, but you can still outrun their cultists. Still, despite the small scale victories, Grimdark makes sure our characters will have to deal with this pervasive unpleasantness basically forever. And the last staple of Grimdark is gray and gray morality. Some stories have black and white morality, where the heroes are good, and therefore everything they do is good, and the villains are bad, and thus do only bad things. Most modern media avoids full-on black and white morality, and will allow their heroes to do questionable things and their villains to be a bit more nuanced and sympathetic, but it rarely dips into full-on gray and gray morality, where all the characters are working in a very murky area. In gray and gray morality, the righteousness of an action becomes irrelevant. Some other paradigm is in play. Maybe all that matters is survival, or revenge, or some other fundamentally self-centered goal. The morality of what the characters do in pursuit of that goal isn't a factor, or at least not one that matters to them. Pointing it out to them is pointless. Gee, Mr. Punisher, did you know that murder is wrong? Oh, golly, I hadn't considered that. Guess I'll leave my dead family unavenged. See, that's not the paradigm they're working under. Even if there is a grand-scale good versus evil conflict going on, these guys aren't invested in it. Now, one of the more interesting and frustrating things when discussing Grimdark is this pervasive idea that Grimdark is inherently more realistic than other genres. I talked about this way back when I did a trope talk on realism, so I'll try not to get too far off track, but the short of it is, Grimdark was a bit of a direct reaction to the more lighthearted, optimistic stories of the pre-Dark Age.
This
Those
is
stories
true.
had heroes and happy endings, and Grimdark said, that's dumb, and also for babies, check this out, and then started telling stories without those things. This ties into the general idea that optimism is naive, something you're supposed to grow out of, and pessimism is real, the state you grow into. And that's a load of hooey. Yeah, I said it. What are you gonna do, be sad at me about it? Optimism...
It's true, but she said some things that I'm kind of disagreeing with, but I'm going to wait to see where she's going with this.
Optimism and pessimism are two sides of the same concept. One anticipates a good state of being, the other a bad one. Half full versus half empty. Ultimately, it's the state that matters, not what you expect it to be. So for the most part, optimism and pessimism are just personal attitudes and don't matter that much. But optimism and pessimism, when expanded into universalized concepts, produce two very different worldviews. The optimistic worldview believes that things can go well, that the world can be better. The pessimistic worldview believes that they can't and won't. And in this case, the optimists have it. The world can improve and has several times. Heroes have existed, and the world has been, on occasion, saved by them, or at least greatly improved. This is the concept highlighted by classic fantasy authors like Tolkien. Grimdark is part of the counter-argument put forward in response to that by more jaded authors, like George R.R. Martin. Now, this counter-argument isn't all Grimdark. At its most sophisticated, it's more of an attempt to humanize these otherwise mythologized heroes, to point out that the people who changed the world, even for the better, were still people, and thus probably at least kind of an asshole. Now, Tolkien and
Now, I viewed Martin's as the middle role in that, like, I didn't see Game of Thrones as in any way grimdark. It was gritty, but it was not grimdark. I think that's the point she's trying to make as far as this. I think that's the point she is making. But I don't know. Maybe I'm overlooking something she's saying. I got a feeling that's what's happening. I'm overlooking something she's saying, because she was hammering on points a few minutes ago. I think I didn't hear something all the way, or something just didn't click. So I'm gonna keep going.
Martin are actually really good examples here, because for one thing, they both did a really good job presenting their worldview, and for another, they're really not as opposed as people seem to think.
Exactly.
And here's the kicker. They both delved into realism. Yeah, really. While Game of Thrones is much more low fantasy and low magic than Lord of the Rings, neither author shied away from the realistic human element of their respective adventures. George R.R. Martin doesn't shy away from showing a character pooping themselves, but Tolkien also delved into some pretty intense psychological misery when he wrote Sam and Frodo struggling immensely to make their way through Mordor, tired and miserable and forgetting the taste of food. The scenario was fantastical, but the characters reacted in very realistic ways.
Exactly.
And someone who fought in World War II would be pretty qualified to describe the malingering effects of dragging yourself through a war zone and forgetting what it felt like to be anywhere else. Plus, if you've ever read the Silmarillion, Tolkien's not exactly an idealist, and he certainly doesn't shy away from the gross stuff. There's plenty of incest and murder. I mean, he did base it on Norse mythology. The only real difference between these two is the framing of the world. Tolkien's fantasy world can be saved. Heroism and moral righteousness pay off, and the good guys save the day. Martin, not so much. Delving into court intrigue and political power plays mean a lot more assassinations and a lot less actual good getting done. Can this world be saved? I mean, probably, but not by any of these guys who are so caught up in their personal squabbles they literally can't agree if fighting the endless zombie death army is a good idea.
Connor, stop it. The dog was scratching himself.
Or not. In any other year, I'd have called that unrealistic. While Martin fits the grimdark aesthetic more, he's really not as steeped in it as some people think. And the idealist high fantasy he's pitted against has a lot more in common with his work than some people would like to admit. Now, there's one very interesting thing about grimdark. Since the no real happy endings rule is pretty definite, that kind of rules out most plot-driven storytelling. It's hard to get an audience invested in the outcome if it's guaranteed to be unpleasant. In light of that, most grimdark narratives end up being either character-driven or theme-driven. We can get invested in characters no matter how morally dubious they might be, and a lot of grimdark stories
Okay, now I see where she was going.
sell us completely on the character dynamics and convince us to root for an ending that has no good impact on the world overall, but provides some kind of closure for the characters. The ending doesn't even really need to be that satisfying if it leaves us feeling the right kind of unpleasant. For instance, The Last of Us got the audience to root for Joel and Ellie to get along. From the beginning, we sympathize with Joel, but he still acts like a jerk. And we like Ellie, because, let's face it, she was handcrafted to be sassy and lovable. This causes us to root for Joel's character development to make him less of a jerk, because we want to see Ellie happy, and she's invested in him being nicer to her. And when Joel starts opening up, that lets us get invested in their dynamic and root for it to improve. Some grimdark goes even darker for the resolution. Various issues of Sin City successfully guide the audience to root for the protagonist to die. Yeah, it mostly works because the characters come across as very lost and purposeless, except for their gritty determination to either murder somebody or protect somebody at all costs. They convince you over and over again that for these characters, dying after successfully doing their one thing is the only satisfying conclusion. How grim. And dark. And then there's theme-driven Grimdark, where the characters are basically exemplary victims of the horribleness of the scenario they're stuck in. Grimdark themes often explore cosmic horror, hopelessness in the face of overwhelming force, the terrors of authoritarianism, and basically anything that boils down to, this sucks and I can't do anything about it. These stories...
Okay, so a lot of the reason I was sitting there, thinking, it was because I was thinking more 40K-centric versus anything else. But looking at it through the lens of these other ones, I wouldn't consider Lord of the Rings, not Lord of the Rings, I wouldn't consider Game of Thrones Grimdark by any stretch of the imagination. I really wouldn't. 1984 is. Basically, that was the disconnect.
Stories are ways to explore deeply unpleasant scenarios. Books like 1984 do so specifically as a political warning, and many post-apocalypses are similarly theme-driven to get across that, hey kids, destroying the world is probably bad. But you also get a certain amount of overlap, where a character-driven narrative still explores a central theme, like humanity or the loss of humanity, which is quite popular, or even something really specific, like how Mad Max Fury Road is about the pointlessness of searching for a perfect promised land instead of putting in the hard work to build the best life you can from what you have. But for all that, it can kind of be hard to see the appeal of Grimdark. Like, for me, personally, I have pretty simple tastes. I like heroes, and I like happy endings, and I don't really have that much patience for edgier-than-thou nihilism. I can understand the appeal of more nuanced stories with bittersweet endings or unconventional protagonists, but Grimdark as a genre kinda strips away everything that I personally like about stories and storytelling. It's hard for me to get invested. I want characters I can root for playing out arcs that I want to see resolved. For the longest time, I didn't get the appeal at all. And then I watched Chicago. Now, I'm gonna be clear. Chicago does not fit the Grimdark aesthetic. It's a dang movie musical. It's all glitz and glamour and all that jazz. But there are no heroes. Every single protagonist is a terrible human being. There's no interest in morality. The protagonists are all murderers trying to avoid legal consequences for their actions, and the lawyer helping them do it. And the outcome that you're theoretically rooting for is a total miscarriage of justice. And there's really no hope for a happy ending, because it's clear from minute one that the protagonist, Roxy, kinda sucks and really can't make it in showbiz like she wants, and that what she's mistaken for her fame is just her 10 minutes in the spotlight because of the murder she did. There's no one to root for, and there's no happy ending. I should have been clicking back over to Dragon Ball Z 10 minutes in, but I didn't. And it took me a little while to figure out why. It's because the characters were well written and inherently compelling, and while none of them were headed for a happy ending, some of them were heading for karmically satisfying ones. Watching these terrible people from a third-person omniscient perspective lets you really appreciate how terrible they are, and then you get to watch their dreams die as they crash and burn. It's oddly satisfying, like a story without heroes that still lets you watch a villain get their third act comeuppance. Now that's one reason Grimdark can be appealing, but it's not the only reason. I asked Twitter for some thoughts on the appeals and pitfalls of Grimdark and found a few recurring themes in the answers. One of those themes is catharsis by proxy. When a character we relate to on any level goes through something emotionally intense, we, the audience, feel it from a distance. Catharsis, the process of releasing very strong or repressed emotions, can feel very freeing or satisfying, even if the emotions involved are miserable or exhausting. So a character...
Yeah, I can relate to this in a very personal way. Battlestar Galactica was one of my favorite remakes of a show, period. And some of the things that I saw in that really hit home for me. Really, they hurt. But it's a show that I have rewatched good Lord knows how many times at this point. And it's because of those, the one thing, if I were to explain, when I explain, the actual opener to that show, this is, the one scene that I remember right now without any thought whatsoever is right when the colonies have been attacked, and, they're on board that ship, the ship, and the messages came through that all of the colonies have been nuked, and the primary defense hub has been nuked, and the pilot of the vessel turns around and his hand is shaking when he's got the message in his hand, and that has stuck with me forever because I lived through something kind of similar. And they actually aimed at the September 11th attacks for, the inspiration for how they wanted the feel of the episode to go. And they nailed it.
Character in a Grimdark narrative going through the absolute emotional ringer can provide the audience with a feeling of catharsis without having to go through the actual bad stuff. Of course, this isn't unique to Grimdark. Any story can do it, even one as quote-unquote idealistic as Lord of the Rings, or as child-friendly and simplistic as any shonen anime. But it is an appeal, and it shouldn't be discounted. Now, the other common theme I found was perspective. A character in a Grimdark narrative goes through a lot. If the audience compares the character's experience to their own life, instead of relating to that character and feeling for that character, they might end up feeling a sense of relief. Like, hey, things are lousy, but at least I didn't just get stabbed by my own dudes or bitten by zombies. It's like the relief of waking up from a nightmare. The nightmare sucked and you don't want to do it again, but realizing it's not real can be very soothing. A whole lot of things you were worrying about suddenly don't matter anymore.
True.
Now, while this can work, it only really works if the audience doesn't care about the character. Audiences can get very invested, and it doesn't necessarily matter if their own life is really comfortable if their favorite fictional character is having a really bad time. They might go better them than me, or they might send the author death threats. It is interesting to note, by the way, that both perspective and catharsis by proxy only work if they're
Yeah, and seriously, people that send authors death threats because they did something to a character that they liked are just fucking stop it. Seriously.
form of negative escapism. People who actually deal with very upsetting stuff on a daily basis, like grief counselors, people struggling with personal trauma, etc., often actively avoid all things Grimdark and favor much more lighthearted, optimistic media. If Grimdark is like a cold shower, a quick bout of misery to energize you for the rest of the day, then you can see why it wouldn't seem too appealing for someone who spends the rest of their day in the emotional equivalent of an ice bath. There was also an interesting answer I noticed where some people suggested that seeing characters struggle even in the face of utter hopelessness was encouraging. And I'm gonna be honest, that one doesn't make any sense to me, because Grimdark prides itself on screwing over those exact characters. If you want to see persistence in the face of hopelessness be rewarded, you can look to any other genre of fiction. Grimdark is pretty much the only one that'll swat you in the face with a wet towel and call you a dork for believing the universe would ever reward a heroic effort. And if it doesn't do that, it's not Grimdark. I guess the bottom line is...
In that case, 40K isn't Grimdark. I utterly disagree with that statement. In that case, 40K is not Grimdark. Because the entirety of the struggle is a struggle for pure survival. And yes, the characters do die. And yes, I bought 56 books of the Horus Heresy series, and so far, all the ones in the Siege of Terra, and I'm going to be getting a new one soon. And I already know how this story ends. I already know how this story ends. This story ends in the worst possible outcome. But some of the stories are literally excellence in the way that they're written. Some of the characters are. The journey that you go through. And it's not so much about, look, they're struggling, they're going to get kicked down. It's about the struggle. It is purely about the struggle. And I'm going to keep on going with this. I'll add some more thoughts at the end, but I disagree with that statement entirely.
Is Grimdark has appeal. I mean, obviously, enough people like it that it has to be doing something. Even though it's precision crafted to be generally unpleasant and miserable, it really does work for some people, and sometimes you're in the mood for a little catharsis by proxy. But it works best in moderation, and it's definitely not the be-all end-all pinnacle of fiction. It has its place, but so does the stuff it's a reaction against.
Yes.
Grimdark can be aggressively nihilistic, but the purpose of fiction is, in many cases, to inspire. And nihilism generally doesn't do that. In his 1993 essay,
I'm thinking she's talking about all Grimdark in general, but 40K means something completely different to me.
Let There Be Dragons, acclaimed Discworld author and all-around excellent dude Sir Terry Pratchett said something that I personally think is unimaginably beautiful and incidentally also describes 100% of my thoughts on Grimdark. The quote goes like this: "Why does the third of the three brothers, who shares his food with the old woman in the wood, go on to become the king of the country? Why does Bond manage to disarm the nuclear bomb a few seconds before it goes off, rather than, as it were, a few seconds afterwards? Because a universe where that did not happen would be a dark and hostile place. Let there be goblin hordes, let there be terrible environmental threats, let there be giant mutated slugs if you really must, but let there also be hope. It may be a grim, thin hope, an Arthurian sword at sunset, but let us know that we do not live in vain." Hope is the ultimate motivator. On some level, it's the only motivator. If it seems like I have personal beef with Grimdark as a genre, it's only the same beef I have with everything that treats hope like a dumb, childish concept rather than the fundamental core of human experience. Hope makes us believe things can be better. Once we stop believing that, we stop trying to make things better. And guess what? Then things don't get better. Pessimistic nihilism is the ultimate self-fulfilling prophecy, and maybe it's the 2020 talking, but man, I have straight up run out of patience with people who give up on a better world and then have the audacity to tell other people that they're naive or stupid for still trying. The Grimdark worldview preaches that everything sucks and nothing will make it better. If the ideal of the Grimdark genre is really struggle in the face of hopelessness, then act like it. Dare to believe the world can be better and fight for it. And if that's really the ideal of Grimdark, then why does every other genre do a better job of inspiring it? Grimdark can totally be fun, but man, don't let it define your worldview. So, yeah. And thanks to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. By now you're probably aware that World Anvil is a browser-based world-building and novel-writing software designed to family trees to keep track of your characters. And if you want the bonus frills, you can get 20% off all...
Okay, so she has a promo code with... I'll put her information down there. She has World Anvil. I don't know if this is still the case because this came out probably about a year ago.
Okay, so I had to come back to this point just to basically argue my point for a second here. The sheer fact of the matter is 40K rewards you for looking for the hope in the struggle against hopeless odds. At every single point that you turn in 40K, there are ridiculously hopeless odds. And there doesn't seem to be any light at the end of the tunnel in most of the cases. In fact, a lot of the stories are very dark and depressing, especially at the end. You can't take a look at the novel for Hell's Reach and tell me that it's not, the ending isn't really, really just sad. But what you don't read, if you don't read any further on the character, is that Grimaldus goes on from that battle and saves another chapter another Space Marine chapter from extinction, and gives them back their honor. There's a lot of things in 40K that you have to immerse yourself in, and the biggest problem that people have these days is they do not want to immerse themselves into a setting. 40K is one of those stories that you have to immerse yourself into. You have to view it from their viewpoint, because if you look at it from the outside, you're never going to enjoy what you're looking at. You're never going to enjoy what you're seeing. And so, the biggest thing for me in any universe is the universe itself. What are its rules? What's the general vibe? What are the characters' motivations? What are their drives? What are their desires? What are the threats? What is the hope? And the hope in 40K is survival. And there is a pug in here that is paying me a visit. Connor, what are you doing in here? You know you're not supposed to be in here. Go on. Go. Yeah, get your butt out. Thank you. The whole thing in 40K is a struggle for existence, and the hope that something very, very positive is going to happen later down the line. But even that is wrapped up in just an absolute horror story. That's the appeal for 40K to me. And the appeal is just flatly grounded in, yes, these characters are going through horrible times. There's a character I'm, reading in a novel right now, and all he's doing is dying. All he's doing is dying, but the only thing I want to see happen is for him to reach his brothers. And that's the biggest victory in my head. For him to be with his brothers when he finally goes. It's victories like this that make 40K so appealing to me. It's stories like Grimaldus. It's stories like Kaifas Kane. It's stories like Karn the Betrayer and what he went through. And Angron's story. And that's the reason I love theory crafting so much. Because of, there's so much to see. Even the simple lasgun could take a 30-minute lore video to explain in total. And to take a look at it from the outside in, yes, it's a horrible thing, but the problem people have is they don't immerse themselves into a story anymore. They just want the happy ending. They just want the, the quick fix, everything's good again, stuff like that. 40K doesn't work like that because it's playing a excessively long game. I wouldn't even watch Game of Thrones after one season if Ned Stark had survived. I wouldn't have kept on watching it because, for me, the fact that bad things happen to good characters, and the actions of good characters aren't rewarded is something. It's something. It's true to life, for one. It's very true to life. But at the same time, good characters have bad things happen to them. If it doesn't kill them, it makes them stronger. It makes them better. 40K is, for me, an immersive thing. Because if I were to pull out my immersion, why am I cheering on these insane zealots? Why am I cheering on some of the characters that are built to be the protagonists? It's because I want to see them succeed, for humanity to make it, for things to happen. And here's the thing: for as much as people say, "Oh yeah, the Grimdark," if the next novel in the 42nd millennium ends with the Emperor's finger twitching, people are going to lose their minds. People will lose their minds, including yours truly, because it's a sign that even in the absolute darkest period, even in the worst possible instance, there is hope. And I have not met many 40K people that are absolute nihilists. I just haven't. 40K is a story about drawing. 40K for me has helped me out in a lot of ways, because I went through times in my life that weren't that good, and 40K helped me out a lot with that, because I'd read the novels and I'd read about these characters going through horrible things. Yes, appeal number one that she mentioned, Catharsis. I'd read about them going through horrible things. I'd see them fail. But the struggle against hopeless odds, maybe it's the way she worded it, but it just hit me. It hit me in a way that I didn't really. It was probably the way I took it because of my investment in 40K as a genre. But I love every single data story in Star Trek. Star Trek is one of the most noble, bright series that you can get. The bad guys clearly defined. The good guys clearly defined, except for the new Trek, which I don't even want to go into. But data story, war story, Picard in and of himself, Then, of course, you got the older Trek, and you've got some of the newer Trek. You've got Star Wars. All these stories I really do take a part in, but I have to immerse myself in the universe and know things from those characters' perspectives. Otherwise, it's not a good story to me. I can't watch an hour and a half movie and enjoy it if the characters aren't, in my view, realistic, if they don't have flaws, if they don't have things like that. And she's very much correct in the fact that some things tell stories better than the Grimdark. But for me, the Grimdark holds an extremely special place because the wins mean something different in 40K. The losses mean something completely different too. For every person that sits there and says, well, Cadia got destroyed, there's another person that says Cadia stands. And that's my whole point about that. The Terry Pratchett quote that she put up made a lot of sense to me, because the then ray of hope is what 40K is for me. And I'm a big Imperial fan. That's my whole deal. The then ray of hope is something is going to happen with the Emperor where he can start taking back over. And yes, it's not great. It wouldn't be great if the Emperor woke up and we tried to compare. Oh, the Emperor's going to come back and everything's going to be great, and we're going to live in a universe where everybody's sunshine, happy, and holding hands. But it's going to be better. Humanity has a better chance to live And that's where I draw all of my satisfaction from 40K, because there could be something great right around the corner. Hope is still there. Anybody that's watched Text-to-Speech, if the Emperor had a text-to-speech device, remembers that one episode where the Star Child inhabits Fyodor Karamazov. I almost started crying when that happened. And you just go down and look in the comments sections, where were you when Hope returned to the galaxy? Even though it's a complete parody, even though it's completely, the storyline of it is completely hilarious, it was so well done and so emotional because you're so invested. And not just invested in the parody itself, but the actual characters of that are involved in the story. So, saying that something isn't grimdark if it doesn't kick you for, having hope and making you feel super for having hope, I don't agree with that. But yeah, one second. And something she said in her closing thought I do agree with as well. I don't really like anything that treats hope like as she said, a stupid childish concept, and that's part of the reason I love 40K as much as I do, because you're beaten down but rewarded. Like, you were beaten down but you're rewarded at the end of the day, because Caiaphas Cain doesn't die. Not nearly as many times as he's been reported to die. He's still in active service. But Grimaldus loses everyone and walks out, and then goes on to continue with the Black Templars. Sigismund dies, but he dies with such honor, it's staggering. Sanguinius falls, but his fall is something that is remembered with abject reverence, that he gave his life for his father. The Emperor... Would you stop scratching stuff? The Emperor is a mummified corpse, but there's the possibility he could return. Hey, Connor, stop it. He's just out there making noise. I'm pretty sure you guys can hear him. But yeah, all things in all, I really did agree with pretty much most of the things she said. Some of the things she said might not pertain to 40K at all, and I'm just, I'm so into 40K, it just is what it is. But I agree with most of the things she said. I can't stand overly dark and hope-crushing scenarios. But I love 40K because it rewards my hope in it in just the right way. In the exact right way. Because even though I have bought every book of the Horus Heresy series and the Siege of Terror, I know exactly how this is going to end. I know how it's going to end. I've known how it was going to end since I first picked up, like my second or third 40K book. I knew how this massive series of books was going to end. But it doesn't change the fact that I want to read them because of stories like Euphrates Tequila and stories like Sevatar. I want to find out what happens to Sevatar. I want to find out what happens to... I want to find out flat out what happens to Latara Sarin. But, all things considered, this was a great video. I'm going to check her latest video and see if she has any promo codes going on. I'll put them down in the description down below. Other than that, my Patreon's down there. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I will catch you guys next time.